Hey, welcome to the fifth lecture for International Regulatory Frameworks for Climate Change and Environment Management. In this lecture, we're going to look at marine pollution laws. So we looked in the last lecture at Ramsar, World Heritage and CITES. So MARPOL 73-78 comes in that sort of period, and in the next lecture we'll go on to UNCLOS, which was signed in 1982. So in outline, we're going to cover MARPOL 73-78 is the focus, but it's really understanding the history and why it was, how it came to be agreed. I'll mention the London Convention, International Convention on Oil Pollution Preparedness in 1990. UNCLOS also has a marine pollution component, but I'll just mention that. There's plenty of stuff on marine pollution, like in the UNEP training manual that I gave you as a general reference, chapter 13. So if you were particularly interested in this topic, because you work in the area, sure, go and have a look at it. But for our purposes, the real reason for dealing with it is to understand how it came to be that we got these treaties in the 70s, because it's. So we were talking in the last lecture about the context, so won't recap on that. Environment concern emerges. We talked about Silent Spring and the like. The International Maritime Organization had been created and provides a great website for marine pollution generally, so that's a good general reference for these topics. The background to MARPOL 73-78, you really need to start with oil poll, 1954. So all you really just summarise it as this: it was a treaty in 1954 driven by the UK for basically dealing with oil pollution, but it was very limited and only dealt with essentially intentional disposal of oil in harbour and that sort of stuff. It didn't deal with major disasters and preparing for them or ship designs or anything like that. So it was a very, very limited treaty. Then in 1967, the Torrey Canyon disaster occurred, as I mentioned in the last lecture. So massive coverage at the time. So here's the Torrey Canyon before it broke up. So as I said in the last lecture, it ran aground in good weather, and they misjudged their position. They hit rocks that were marked on nautical maps, well known. I think they were called Wolf Rock. And yeah, they got stuck. And you can see there the ship with the pretty obvious slick behind it. So tugboats tried to get it off, but couldn't. And then in a storm it broke up and spilled basically its entire cargo of oil. And the oil drifted through the English Channel and on to France. So it was a massive spill at the time. Here you can see some images of tugboats leaving. They tried to drag it free and couldn't. And you can see the ship there stuck and the oil basically spilling out behind it. And as I say, it then broke apart and spilled its entire cargo. The RAF, to basically burn up the oil, they bombed it and deliberately set it alight. And so this is 1967. The newspapers laughed at the RAF because they said the RAF had gotten so bad they actually missed the ship in their first attempt. You know, this ship sitting there stuck on a rock, and they missed it. So they had to bomb it a second time, set it alight, and yeah, just massive clouds of smoke rising up. So that's a background. I just mentioned a couple of things when you look at marine pollution, but also law of the sea generally. Distinguish between a couple of different jurisdictional hooks that countries have. So what's called the flag state are countries that the ships are registered in. So and obviously traditionally linked to the idea of flying the national flag, from the ship. So it's called the flag state. So a ship can be registered. If you're a tanker, you can be registered in, any country you want. basically. You could be registered in Australia, you could be registered in Spain, you could be registered in the United Kingdom, you could be registered in Germany, wherever you want to be. Generally, it might be where you're based, where your major base is, and wherever you're registered, that's your flag state. And because you're registered there, the flag state can basically control you, control activities and what you do. So if you're a fishing vessel and you are registered in Australia, you can be subject to Australian law, even if you go and you're fishing in the middle of the Atlantic, well away from Australia, but there is the relationship between Australia and you, legitimate. And one of the major things with maritime controls is the flag state is really powerful. And the difficulty that raises is because a ship can move around. If you are a company that wants to sort of go out and pillage the environment or have really dodgy standards, you want to run a ship that's really decrepit because it's cheaper than running a high standard ship, and or you buy an old ship and it's in really bad state, and if you don't like the requirements that a country imposes upon you, you can simply register your ship in another country, and what are called flags of convenience. So the famous ones are Panama, particularly, was famous for being a flag of convenience. So a lot of ships would go and register in Panama. Obviously, there's the canal, but it also had very, very low standards for just general shipping. But the country then gets an income. So if you're a poor country and a ship comes and pays you, let's just say $10,000 to be registered, it's $10,000 income that you weren't otherwise going to get. And what do you care if they go and, drop oil somewhere off Africa, if it's not affecting you, well, what does it matter? And if you get a lot of ships registering in your country, then that's, a lot of income. So the flag state, important to understand. The port state, pretty obvious. It's like if you go into port, a country can have control over you, once you're within their jurisdiction. And then the coastal state is really a state that has a coastline, and there's maritime zones extending out from areas where a country can control out to. And as we'll see in the next lecture on UNCLOS, 200 nautical miles is the major limit for controlling fisheries and the like. There's other limits for customs and those sorts of things. And so we'll look at the different maritime zones in the next lecture, but that's the coastal state. Outside of coastal water, or not coastal waters as a term, outside of maritime zones that a country can have as a coastal state is called the high seas. And once you're on the high seas, you're subject to the laws of your flag state where you're registered. As I mentioned yesterday in relation to whaling, that citizens can also be subject to their laws. Laws of the country where they're a citizen of. So I mentioned that there is an Australian law that makes it illegal for Australian citizens to kill whales anywhere in the world. It doesn't matter what ship they're on at the time, because they're an Australian citizen, they can be subject to Australian law. Generally though, most laws aren't applied in that way. Like aircraft and ships, when they're essentially between jurisdictions, they're subject to the laws of. So, if a plane is flying between here and the United States of America and someone is killed, midway across the Pacific, what laws apply? You generally apply the laws of where the aircraft is registered. As soon as the plane lands, it's then subject to the laws where it's landed. Similar for ships. So you've got port states, coastal states, but flag state is the really important one to be aware of. Okay, so in that context, following the Torrey Canyon disaster, there was an international conference in 1973, so dates are important here. It adopted the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, but it failed to get sufficient ratification to enter into force. So most ships are registered in the UK, the USA, Spain, Russia, a few others, increasingly, China and other. But, the big ships don't just go and register in Botswana because it's easy. There are advantages to being registered with a particular, country. So particularly the United Kingdom. So those big jurisdictions where a lot of international shipping was registered were reluctant to impose that from their perspective. They didn't want ships to leave their registries to go and register in the other big jurisdictions because of the costs. If they lose essentially the registration, they lose a lot of income. So they were reluctant to ratify it. And then, so it basically, it didn't look like it was going to be ratified. It wouldn't get sufficient signatories with sufficient tonnage of ships to ratify it for it to actually enter into force. So it looked like it was going to fail. What happened though was in 1978, there was another massive disaster in the English Channel, the Amoco Cadiz oil disaster. So this is a picture of it. You don't have to be an expert in ships to realise that that's an unusual looking ship where half of it is underwater, and that's a big ship, and that's not how it's supposed to look. So you can see there another image of it, and you can see the tower at the back. As everyone's aware, that should be pointing to the bow, and it ain't. So the ship is broken in two. What had happened was, and I'll play you a little film at the moment, which is a bit dated, but it sets, again, good historical context. Basically, the ship lost power in a storm and was driven onto rocks and broke apart. So that's where it grounded on Ports aux Rocs in France. And this is some of the oil left afterwards. So a really beautiful part of France in Brittany, completely covered in oil. And let's just see if this little clip on YouTube.
Ultimately causing a vast oil spill, it released around 255 million litres of crude oil into the Atlantic off the coast of France. It was the main event of 1978. Devastating scenes of marine life dying under a film of oil were broadcast around the world, as over 14,000 volunteers and members of the armed forces got to work cleaning up the most heavily oiled rocks, beaches and creeks. The tanker was en route from the Persian Gulf to Rotterdam via Great Britain, transporting millions of litres of crude oil when it encountered a fierce winter storm with high seas and gale force conditions. A heavy wave hit the tanker, crippling its rudder. It was unable to respond to steering commands. After unsuccessful attempts to repair the damage, the crew put out a distress call that it was no longer able to manoeuvre. Several ships responded, including the German tug the Pacific, but their attempts proved incapable of preventing the supertanker from drifting perilously towards the coast of Finisterre in Brittany, France, because of its huge mass and the gale force winds. At around 9 p.m, the Amoco Cadiz hit the bottom for the first time, flooding the tanker's engines, while a second strike ripped open the hull, releasing its load into the open sea. About an hour after the first hit, the Amoco Cadiz broke into two sections, releasing its entire cargo of over 1.5 million barrels of crude oil. With the French not prepared for such a catastrophic event, the cleanup took time to get underway, hampered as it was by rough seas. The use of precipitating agents prevented the slicks from drifting to the Channel Islands, but millions of litres of oil washed onto French beaches, reaching deep into the sand. The beach cleanup was carried out in two stages, the pumping of still liquid oil and the removal of oiled waste. All along the oiled coastline, animal and plant populations were dying in vast numbers. It had become one of the world's biggest environmental disasters. The Amoco Cadiz's cargo formed a dark, dense, slimy blanket both above and below the waterline, a dangerous mix of oil and water that polluted all life forms that drifted through it. The ecological impact was coupled with the long-term effects it would have on the local economy for shellfish and oyster fishermen. The oil, which belonged to the Shell Oil Company, created a slip 29 kilometres wide and 128 kilometres long. It polluted approximately 321 kilometres of Brittany coastline. The isolated location of the tanker and the rough seas hindered clean-up efforts for many weeks following the incident. The Amoco Cadiz slowly sank, but the wreck had to finally be completely destroyed using depth charges set by the French Navy. In 1978, the disaster was estimated to have caused over $250,000 in damage to both fisheries and tourism services. The French government took legal action against the Amoco International Oil Company and presented claims totaling $2 billion to the United States courts. Ultimately, France was awarded $120 million from the American Oil Company, but it took until 1990. The Amoco Cadiz oil spill was the greatest environmental disaster of its time, and as a result, the French government set up measures to reduce the risk of accidents and to ensure better rescue and response methods. The environmental impact of the Amoco Cadiz oil spill can still be felt to this day.
Okay, so you get the idea of how big a deal it was, and essentially what then happened was so in response to that disaster, obviously massive at the time, and with so much shipping being centred in Europe, in 1978, in response to those tanker accidents, particularly the Amoco Cadiz, the IMO held a conference on tanker safety and pollution in February 1978. And so what happened was that the 1973 convention hadn't entered into force and was essentially combined into the 1978 convention. So they're now known as MARPOL 73-78. And it finally entered into force in 1983 for annexes. Again, there's annexes, and it's very technical in terms of the requirements of it. If you're into maritime law and marine shipping, it's broken into 6 annexes, and it's wider than OilPol, which is only about accidental release. It's both dealing with OilPol was only about essentially little spills in harbours and discharge of oily substances and those sorts of things from routine operations. It deals with both large scale accidents as well as routine operations. 6 technical annexes: Annex 1, oil; Annex 2, noxious liquid substances in bulk; Annex 3, package form, harmful substances in package form; sewage is Annex 4, Annex 5, garbage, and Annex 6 is air pollution. And countries can sign up to different annexes. So, but oil being the one that gets most, the biggest ticket item. Okay, in terms of world's worst oil spills, you can go and have a look at it. Deepwater Horizon was a massive one. Interestingly, not covered by MARPOL because it wasn't a vessel. Essentially it didn't come within that, but it was within US jurisdiction, covered by that. The Amoco Cadiz is number 10, 223,000 tonnes of crude oil. Torrey Canyon, quite a bit less. The Exxon Valdez, which I'll talk about in a moment, is actually much smaller than the Amoco Cadiz. In terms of the status of the convention, you can see there in terms of the contracting parties, number of contracting parties, 169, and then there's for the International Maritime Organization Convention, but then MARPOL annexes, you've got different numbers going down to Annex 6 only being 60. In terms of the percentage of world tonnage of shipping, you can see though that covers virtually all shipping. I really just want to mention it, the provisions of the convention to understand the ratification, the entry into force trigger, because that's interesting. The entry into force for this convention is based on the signatories that have signed on, that have ratified, and their percentage of global shipping. So you get the similar sort of structure to the other treaties we've looked at. You get the introductory preamble setting out the problem, saying oil pollution is a big deal. Then some general definitions, general obligations set out in Article 1 and refers to annexes. And then Article 5, this is the entry into force provision that I wanted to flag for you. So the present protocol shall enter into force 12 months after the date on which not less than 15 states, the combined merchant fleets of which constitute not less than 50% of the gross tonnage of the world's merchant shipping, have become parties to it in accordance with Article 4 of the present protocol. So, a entry into force threshold built around 15 states, but the second part is the really important bit, because if you've got 15 states from very small countries that don't have a lot of shipping, it's not going to be effective. It was really aimed at the big shipping nations where most things are registered, like the UK, like France, like Spain, and deliberately written, so that the big players didn't want ships leaving their registries to go to others that might be cheaper for them to be registered in. They wanted to sort of act as a group and not be, going forward in a way that might cost them economically. So there's 5 annexes there. There's the 6th one now with air pollution. I would just mention, so we've got MARPOL 73, 78, but then you can fast forward to 1990, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So this involved a ship. I'm sure most people. I was a kid when this happened, so many people weren't even born. I'm sure when that happened, but some people might have been. It was a big deal, hugely in the news. Basically, it happened in Alaska. This ship was coming out. It was fully laden with oil. It was coming out of harbour, and basically the captain was drunk and ran the ship instead of turning as it was supposed to. As it went out of, it basically didn't make the turn that it was supposed to, and he just ran it aground, and it got stuck. And then it starts in Prince William Sound where it ran aground. And it basically caused this huge, you can see Prince William Sound is up here. And this, 1,500 miles of coastline affected, basically, just drifted south in waves. So this map shows the spread of it. Day 4 is this one up here, 27th of March. Day 7, day 11, day 14, day 19, day 38, day 40, day 56. So basically just this huge plume of oil. Here's the Exxon Valdez aground, leaking oil, and huge amount of marine life affected by it. But the really significant thing about this was it happened in a really pristine environment, and it happened in the United States. So a whole heap of US news crews went up there, and there was just wall-to-wall coverage in colour. So it's colour TV. In 1990, basically all of these horrific images of this really, really beautiful area with all of these animals covered. It's apart from the fact that there's oil and it's obviously a disaster, but doesn't it look like a beautiful area? So this amazingly beautiful area, completely spoiled by oil. This huge cleanup area, incredibly pretty. And so. Basically what it led to was wall-to-wall coverage in the US about this disaster. And one thing that there'd been pressure for, but hadn't been taken up at all by governments previously, were double-hulled tankers. And so a double-hulled tanker is designed so that essentially there's an outer skin, because like the tankers before, basically you just had the oil sitting, so it basically went all the way to the sides. So the idea here was we have a double hull, and so there's the internal hulls where the oil is stored, and then your outer hull can be damaged and you don't necessarily lose your cargo. So a greater level of protection, and yeah, so there's the difference. Your single hull tanker, oil's all, and then the double hull tanker with void and ballast space around the. So basically what MARPOL did was adopt a US initiative, because the US passed basically unanimously through both houses of their Congress the Oil Pollution Act, requiring oil ships to have two hulls. So the Oil Pollution Act, because the US was such a massive player in the international shipping arena, that then led to 1992 amendments to Annex 1 of MARPOL 7378, and which made it mandatory for new oil tankers to have double hulls, and brought in a phase-in schedule for existing tankers to fit double hulls. So, yeah, basically that happened almost overnight, and it seems like the idea in 2017 of the US Congress even agreeing on anything, let alone an environmental thing, like it's like, you know, you've been beamed to, you know, Mars, and like this is a different planet. But in 1990 they passed this unanimously through, I think it was virtually unanimously, it might have been unanimously, through both houses of their federal Congress, because it was just blanket news. So that's another example of domestic pressures leading to international regimes. And the key thing that I would emphasise about this regime to be aware of is, as I said by way of introduction, it's a good example about disaster-driven regulation. You have a big disaster, there's huge pressure from the public for the government to do something. Government comes up with a new international convention. In 1973, it didn't ultimately lead to anything more happening. And then there's another big disaster, and the pressure becomes overwhelming. It ends up leading to MARPOL 7378. There's still ongoing problems. And then you have another disaster, Exxon Valdez. It leads to another round of increasingly tighter regulation. So disaster-driven policy, it's a reality. Another, in policy language, people talk about policy windows opening up. So things that might not be possible, suddenly there's an opportunity, either because a charismatic leader spells it out that this is a great opportunity, or there's disasters. So a policy window opens and you make laws and policy around it. Obviously, oil shipping still, there's still problems. So this was the Rena, which ran aground in New Zealand. Again, the captain in good weather, in modern times, modern ship. The captain and the navigator, stuffed up badly. It ran aground and then caused a range of pollution from marine life. And then there's a lot of, it was in the news back in 2011 when it happened, basically, as it basically collapsed, and then they tried to get the containers off it. So you can see there, and it was really dangerous apparently, the crews going onto it to try and get the containers off. And then small spills around the place, oil spills continue to happen. So again, I want to emphasise, a convention like MARPOL hasn't 100% succeeded in stopping oil spills. Nothing could do that. But it has no doubt saved a lot of oil spills from happening. So when you look at effectiveness of conventions like this, it's not 100% success or 100% failure. There's something in between. And when you're looking at how you can improve it, can you look at it in that context? So what practical things can we do to improve it? Deepwater Horizon, another massive event that everyone would be familiar with. So this drilling rig, which you might have, who's seen the movie now, Deepwater Horizon, with that American actor. And essentially the bottom of it broke. It started a fire. Whoops, going the wrong way. So this is it when it was burning, and it just caused this huge spill through the Gulf. And this is just an image of basically what happened was the wellhead down at the bottom. There was a basically they were unable to shut off. They were supposed to be able to shut off an uncontrolled release, and basically gas got up and caused the fire on top of the in the drilling rig, and then they were unable to shut it off on the base, and eventually the rig sank, and the wellhead just continued to spill oil for weeks afterwards, and they had to drill in from the side to try and basically shut off the oil well. And it was in really deep waters. That was the whole point. They were drilling in. So as we've often exhausted a lot of the easy to get oil, and we're going into deeper and deeper places. And this was an example of that, a disaster driven by that. Could the Deepwater Horizon disaster occur in Queensland? The simple answer to that is no. So I just point out in Queensland, back in the 1970s, so in the context of all these big oil spills occurring, and there were a number of massive oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico around the time as well, from oil exploration. So in Australia, there was such public pressure to protect the Great Barrier Reef that our federal government declared, the principal reason for declaring the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park was to make it off limits for oil exploration. Not allowed to even explore for minerals or oil and gas within the Great Barrier Reef, let alone actually extract it. So effectively in Australia, we have prohibited oil exploration on a huge chunk of the coast, which surely must have a lot of oil in it if we wanted to tap it. But Australia basically made the decision, and there's basically you hear zero discussion of anyone in Australia saying, oh, we should go and explore for oil in the Great Barrier Reef, because it's just like this anathema. So we made that decision, and it was a big deal. The dangers of oil and gas drilling were one of the principal reasons for the creation of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. I just mentioned a couple of other things. So there's a Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping of Waste and Other Matter, 1972, and the protocol there too. It's called the London Convention. So dumping of waste. So the idea that you can't take all your waste, particularly really nasty stuff, take it out over the continental shelf, dump it in the ocean. So the London Convention's about stopping countries doing that. So you just can't take your waste, particularly radioactive waste, because the idea with the USR and the US in particular, and countries that have nuclear weapons, like, it might sound strange, but to any rational person, but like, if you've got all this radioactive waste, why don't you just fill it in a big container, take it out into deep water and drop it, and let it just be on the bottom of the ocean? Of course, you can't then control it, and once the container eventually rusts through, might be 1,000 years, but you've then got all of this stuff being spilled into the ocean. So basically we prohibited dumping of dangerous wastes in the deep ocean. And other things, so this is just another convention, just building up the picture of this sort of area. So there's the International Convention on Oil Pollution Preparedness, Response and Cooperation. So basically about countries getting together and helping each other, being prepared, helping, and a global framework for international cooperation to combat major incidents. So remember to be effective. MARPOL and the London Convention need to be implemented through national laws. So just as an example, in Australia, we have passed laws. So say, just so as an example, Australia has signed up to these conventions, but a ship and a ship owner isn't bound by them. So if there is a ship, say in sailing through Australian waters and it dumps oil, it's not in breach of the MARPOL because it's not bound by MARPOL and its owners aren't bound by MARPOL. But it might be in breach of the laws of where it's registered. So if its flag state says a ship registered in our state cannot dump oil, let's just say anywhere in the world, so it might be in breach of its flag state laws, but also if it's in the jurisdiction like a coastal state, it's in a maritime area that has laws that within that area you can't dump oil, then it's also can be in breach of those. So there's two elements. So in Australia, just as an example, I'm really trying to avoid Australian examples as much as possible and make it international, but just as an example, the Protection of the Sea, in brackets, Prevention of Pollution from Ships Act 1983 is federal law, and then within Queensland we've got the Transport Operations Marine Pollution Act 1995, and they generally operate the Protection of the Sea Act deals with things when they're outside harbour or outside state waters. But if a ship, for instance, was to dump oil in Brisbane or just outside, in Moreton Bay or something like that, they'd most likely be prosecuted under state laws like the Transport Operations Act. And so those laws are national or domestic laws implementing international frameworks for marine pollution. Cool? And yeah, I'm going to talk about UNCLOS. It has a marine pollution component, but we'll talk about that in the next lecture. So just to summarise, MARPOL 7378 regulates pollution from ships and a range of other related conventions for dumping and that sort of stuff. Not all oil spills are covered by MARPOL. So the Deepwater Horizon, as I mentioned, it wasn't a ship, so it wasn't covered by it. And in the next lecture, we'll look at UNCLOS, which also deals with marine pollution. And under it, you could cover things like the Deepwater Horizon, even though it's not a ship. So there's a sort of overlapping number of international treaties that deal with these issues, depending on their source. And just finally, I think there might be a further reading one, yeah, but second last slide, wider points. Some international treaties are driven by disasters. MARPOL 7378 was driven by the inadequacies of the previous oil pole, and it was in response to major oil spills, particularly at Torrey Canyon and Amoco Cadiz. And then the Exxon Valdez drove the USA to double holes in 1990, and MARPOL followed suit. So disaster-driven policy. It's real. And when and I'll be saying this when we talk about climate regulation. Climate regulation seems very similar to MARPOL 73. Let's just say it's 1975 and we've yet to have the Amoco Cadiz disaster. So the current inadequate regulation of climate change, my view is it's not going to stay that way. And the response to climate change will be, in my thought, will be disaster driven with basically big jumps. So things that become that are inconceivable now, that you just think there's no way we could politically do it, just like the double hulls in the US, politically inconceivable in 1989, 1990, unanimous in Congress. They passed this, double hull legislation in response to a disaster. Other points, some international treaties are not directly disaster driven, but rather attempts to proactively agree on comprehensive planning and management of international problems. So UNCLOS is a good example. I've also mentioned ozone. Some international treaties are a combination of both reactive and proactive management. So, okay, further reading, there's the training manual if you want to read about marine pollution, chapter 13. And then the IMO website has plenty of stuff about marine pollution if you're interested in that topic.